Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third anniversary lecture, celebrating on this occasion the 300th anniversary of the foundation of the Regius. I was about to forget what it was. the Regius Professorship. I'd like to thank with a few thanks. To start with a few thanks, I'd like to thank the Trevelyan Fund for financing this series of lectures. CUP, likewise, the History Faculty for supporting it. I'd like to thank Peter Mandler for coming up with the idea in the first place and doing the program. And, of course, we'd all like to thank Mary Edwards College, the college at which I actually had my first job. I spent a year replacing Zara Steiner, who was on leave, and working alongside Christine Carpenter at this college, and a very precious year it was. So thanks to the college for hosting us tonight. Well, one of the first things you learn when you consult the Wikipedia page on the Regius Professor of History at the University of Cambridge, I did promise Ludi that I would put some research into my presentation tonight. And one of the first things you learn when you consult the Wikipedia page is that this professorship was initially founded by George I in 1724, among other things, and I quote, "to prevent persons of foreign nations being too often employed in the education and tuition of youth." And it has to be conceded that over the course of its history, this chair has largely succeeded in achieving this not especially admirable ambition, at least in respect of its own incumbents, who have tended not to be foreigners. The three holders of the chair born outside the British Isles were either already British or naturalized by the time they took the chair. The chair has never been held by a woman, it's never been held by a scholar of color, and it's never been held by a person not of British nationality. Some Regii have been productive and celebrated scholars, while others have not. The ne plus ultra of scholarly languor must surely be the second holder of the chair, Mr. Charlotte Turner, whose tenure lasted from 1735 until 1762, nota bene, and of whom Peter Searby reports that he possessed, and I quote, "no qualifications whatsoever for the post, apart from his being a fellow of Peterhouse." Turner's appointment to the chair, I should add, on a stipend which at that time was more than the stipends of all the other professors in the history faculty at Cambridge put together, was followed by 27 years of the profoundest academic inactivity, most of which he spent in Paris. Not all of the Regii were acclaimed by their peers. When they took office, Charles Kingsley opened his inaugural lecture with a show of humility. "It is with a feeling of awe, I had almost said of fear, that I find myself in this place upon this errand," he said when he took up the Regius chair in 1860. Peering out from his Senate House lectern, Kingsley could see, he told his audience, men, yes, they were men, better qualified than he to hold his chair. Unfortunately for him, those men agreed. William Hewell, the Master of Trinity, had only just publicly denounced the new professor as, and I quote, "a howling idiot." God, Kingsley told his listeners, would surely dissipate the prejudices against him. Well, God did not. Kingsley resigned in 1869, dispirited by savage reviews, and great expectations naturally attended the inaugural of the new incumbent, Sir John Seeley, after whom our library and faculty building are named. And yet even Seeley's reflections on the teaching of politics, that was the title of his inaugural lecture, failed to impress the Master of Trinity, now William Hepworth Thompson. I don't know what it is about these Masters of Trinity, but Thompson is said to have left Seeley's inaugural lecture in a state of astonishment, and I quote, "that we should so soon have been regretting poor Kingsley." There can be no better person to reflect on this rather odd institution than Ludmilla Jordanova, Emeritus Professor of History and Visual Culture at the University of Durham. Ludi is the author of numerous important monographs, all of which have marked out, and articles, all of which have marked out a space of inter- and multidisciplinary reflection. From her early study of Lamarck, to sexual visions on images of gender in science and medicine, to her defining features on scientific and medical portraits, to the widely used and cited history and practice, and the look of the past, on how historians use visual and material evidence. And she has been a citizen of our discipline in a broader sense too, serving as a trustee of the National Portrait Gallery and as a member of the council of the science, or the advisory council of the Science Museum Group, a role in which she succeeded, I think, Simon Schaffer. In fact, the two of them were the first historians ever to serve the Science Museum Group in this function. And of course, is a member of the advisory board of the National Railway Museum in York. She also sits, of course, on advisory boards of many professional journals. Rereading her work over the last few weeks, I've been struck by the breadth of her interests, by the way her articles don't report on states of affairs, but map out exploratory, open-ended chains of thought, by the way she gravitates towards the interstitial, the in-between bits of historical practice, the bits where unlike domains of discourse and practice connect or overlap with each other. In an early article, she examined the debate among medical experts over what happened inside the severed head and the truncated body of a person executed under the guillotine. She was interested in the bridges that medical language might build between the body medical and the body politic, between the non-verbal world of bodily experience and the very verbal world of political thought. What interests her about biography, and on this one should see her wonderful essay of 2022 for the Transactions of the Royal Historical Society, is precisely its uncomfortable position within the Academy. The same can be said of her work on public history. She's drawn to the awkward proximity of genres that are contiguous and possibly overlapping, but not necessarily compatible. Ludi has acquired the habit of thinking metahistorically. She has always been attentive to the wide range of genres in which history is written, its relationships with science, emotion, speech, and the image. You can trace some of these interests in her new edited volume, Where Words and Images Meet, which is about to appear with Bloomsbury. But if her writing is theoretically informed, her gaze is nonetheless always pragmatic and humane. The history she looks to is moral, but not moralizing. Historians, she writes in History and Practice, and I'm quoting from her, are tasked with demonstrating how fatuous and dangerous the crude moral polarities are that are so often invoked in history's name. So we could scarcely have chosen a more versatile and distinguished practitioner of and reflector on our discipline than Ludmilla Jordanova to speak to us this evening about the history of the Regius Chair of History. Ludi, it's an honor and a pleasure to invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Chris, thank you for such a generous introduction, and thank you also to the presiding committee for their kind invitation to deliver this lecture. And I'm very aware of what a great privilege it is to do so, and thank you all for coming. On Thursday, June the 13th, 1895, a meeting took place in the Senate House to discuss a suitable, tangible, and long-lasting memorial for Sir John Robert Seeley, who had died in Cambridge on January the 13th, aged 60, having suffered ill health for some time. The name Seeley is familiar to all Cambridge historians, since the library in the faculty building recognises the 9th incumbent of the chair, founded 300 years ago. An account of the 1895 meeting appeared in the Cambridge University Reporter, as you can see, that October, and it reveals an elaborate display of opinions and feelings concerning a man who was, after all, a public figure and a controversial one at that. In using the notion of display, I mean to draw our attention to the formality and careful choreography of such an occasion, as well as to any specifically visual come material form a memorial might take. The ceremonial setting shaped how Seeley was invoked, his legacy and publications discussed. Among his publications, The Expansion of England, first edition 1883, was repeatedly mentioned. It's received a lot of attention in recent years, especially from those interested in the idea of a Greater Britain. But I want to suggest we may be just as interested in the Greater Sealy. Now, Sir John was well known long before expansion appeared, and there he is in the 1870s, so around the time he was in Cambridge. And he was known especially for Ecce Homo, as you can see there, published to considerable controversy in 1865. Now, the book appeared anonymously, but it soon became an open secret who the author was. Many subsequent editions were produced, and recent reprints are now available on Amazon. Sealy was knighted by Lord Rosebery soon after he took office as Prime Minister in March 1894, and he was a man of wide interest, evidenced by his striking range of publications. Interest in him has never abated, and many authors have engaged with him and his legacy, and not just to suggest, as some have claimed, that he was the first proper historian to occupy the chair. Now, the history of the Regius Chair of Modern History, as it was called until 2010, is considerably more complex than that claim implies, and I thought you'd be amused to see the Wikipedia entry, and thank you, Chris, for setting that up for me so beautifully. Now, since reading lists and lecture notes survive from before 1869, when Sealy was appointed to succeed the Reverend Charles Kingsley, who you've already heard about, and he was surely the most famous incumbent, we can get a sense of what history at Cambridge consisted of before the mid-19th century. Now, Sealy himself can help us here, since he contributed to and seems to have been the organiser behind A Student's Guide to the University of Cambridge, first published in 1863. Now, this was a strikingly comprehensive volume, providing estimates of the costs students would incur, the types of accommodation available, the nature of examinations, and lists of reading for subjects such as moral sciences, law and theology, as well as mathematics and classics. And in every one except medicine, historical works are listed. I've used the second 1866 edition, and I note there that there's a paper on the history and philosophy of science, that mathematicians read Newton's Principia, classicists studied numerous historical works by Arnold and Mommsen, for example, and the history of political thought loomed large, and Hallam's constitutional history was frequently mentioned. So it's salutary to see that before the advent of the historical tripos, there was widespread interest in history as a subject and in sources from the past. But that it is possible to delve deeper into the history of the Regius Chair is thanks in no small measure to assiduous clerks and administrators. The record of the meeting in June 1895 was likely compiled by John Neville Keynes, and you see him here in a photograph of 1914, who at that time was secretary to the Council of the Senate, which he'd been since 1892. And this meeting that you saw the front of from the reporter has actually been pasted into a guard book in the university's archives, which is an intriguing artifact in its own right. Sorry, I'm just going to grab a glass of water. So this is the guard book, and that's the call mark if you'd like to consult it. And this is the original grant. And I've put my university library card. Actually, it would be nice if we could have a little bit less light. I don't know if that's possible or how well you can see the images. Thank you. That's perfect. And this is the list in the front of the guard book. And I'm just, this is the sort of thing I'd like you to notice. So that administrators in the university were actually going down to the Public Record Office in some cases, or in conversation with the Public Record Office about getting copies made. So a lot of activity around documenting the history of the Regius Chair, in this case in 1902. And this is the warrant for David Knowles, which is also in the guard book, along with many, many other things. So far as I can tell, this guard book was assembled in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with a very few later items added. It's not a systematic record, but a heterogeneous assemblage of manuscript and published materials that go back to 1629, that is nearly a century before the Regius Chair was formally instituted during the reign of George I. Now, the first document in that guard book is an 1872 copy of a 1629 codicil to Lord Brooke's will, in which he leaves money for, and I quote, "for the maintenance of a public history lecturer within the said University of Cambridge forever," nominating Dr. Isaac Dorislaus as the first incumbent. And from what I can tell, this post petered out some time after Dorislaus died in 1649. Now, this document, I think, reveals 2 points. First, it demonstrates a desire to provide history lectures long before 1724. In fact, Lord Brooke was not the only person who wished to institute a history post at Cambridge, since item 3 in the guard book is an undated proposal to found a professorship of British church history and the Anglo-Saxon language by the antiquarian Sir Henry Spelman, who had died in 1641. Now, my second point is a rather different one, and it concerns the role of the registry, an elected post. The 1872 copy is signed H.R. Luard. There he is. That is Dr. Henry Richards Luard, a medieval historian at Trinity, who was registry between 1862 and 1891, in succession to the, I think, rather wonderful Joseph Romilly, who left incredibly invocative diaries which mention 3 of the Regius chairs, William Smith, Charles Kingsley, and James Stephen. Now, his tenure spanned the years 1807 to 1859. Now, in contributing to and selecting papers for the guard book, Luard acted as a historian to the Regius Chair, along with others, possibly clerks, but also plausibly fellow registraries, who worked with remarkably small teams until the 20th century. Papers were copied, as I said, from originals in the PRO. Letters to the Vice-Chancellor were retrieved. Items were cut out of the Reporter, as were articles in newspapers that related to the chair, and these sit alongside communications from the government about the post, sent directly to the registry, who was responsible, among other things, for giving the professors their share of the fees paid by those attending lectures. Now, Romilly, who was registry between 1832 and his retirement in 1861, himself attended lectures given by William Smith. And given the tiny size of what we might anachronistically call the central administration of the university and the short tenure of vice-chancellors at the time, the registry was the key figure, was a key figure, we might say the key figure, and often, like Keynes, a person of intellectual distinction in his own right. And you can just see a list of some of the relevant registries there. The registry was closely involved with all the university's doings, a major player as well as an invaluable witness. Furthermore, registries handled the money, which came from government to pay incumbent salaries. Bearing these points in mind, I now return to the June 1895 meeting and to Sir John Robert Seeley, classicist, poet, literary critic, biographer of Stein and Napoleon, son of a London publisher and bookseller, Robert Benton Seeley, himself a published author on historical and religious matters. Now, the proceedings of the meeting were recorded in some detail, but it was not actually the first to be convened to commemorate a Regius Professor of Modern History, and nor was Seeley the first public figure to hold the position, since the bust of William Smith was commissioned in the late 1840s, and both James Stephen and Charles Kingsley were well known to the public at the time of their appointments in 1849 and 1860 respectively. But the 1895 meeting is noteworthy by virtue of the attempt to embed Seeley's memory in the doings of what was then usually referred to as the School of History, and in the university more generally. Attention, for example, was paid to the library, which began with a bequest from John Simons, whom you see here, augmented by William Smith's collection, and you see him here, which was also bequeathed to the university, and to a medal to be awarded in Seeley's name. Now, this medal is rare. In the UK, the only public collection to possess one is the British Museum, and it's not, unfortunately, been photographed for their website, but there you can see the description. So the precise date is unclear, but the copper alloy artifact sports a bareheaded portrait of Seeley on the obverse. The guard book contains a number of letters bickering about the process of determining winners, so its administration was clearly a live issue at the end of the 1890s. Now, participants in the Senate House meeting engaged in forms of portrayal, since speakers sought both to evoke the late professor and to recount their association with him in vivid terms. And more than this, the occasion created and brought into being an imagined community by, for example, alluding to those who could not be present but wished to be associated with it, such as Rosebery, Arthur Balfour, and Gladstone, by linking Seeley as an interpreter of the past with Tennyson, Wordsworth, and Milton, poets, quote, closely connected with Cambridge, who were likewise interpreters, and by inviting the audience to distance themselves from critics of Seeley, such as the Lords Beaconsfield and Shaftesbury, while participating in the celebration of an, I quote, so unique a personality, as the Vice-Chancellor put it. Now, the 22 incumbents of the chair so far form another imagined community, the one we are celebrating today. And this lineage is rooted in an ever-changing institution. The fragile coherence of this succession is shored up by a number of forceful figures whose significance as historians is widely attested, even if few are uncontroversial. And Seeley is indeed such a figure whose eminence rests on memory and carefully cultivated posthumous reputation, as well as on his actual life and publications. The 1895 meeting is a valuable record of some of the processes through which Seeley, as it were, in capital letters, and Cambridge history also in capital letters, came into being. Now, the speeches on this occasion necessarily contain broad assumptions and claims about the nature of history. In articulating Seeley's importance, speakers were not just laying out a kind of manifesto, they were in effect working through some intricate issues concerning the practice of history. Many of the interventions mentioned Seeley specifically as thinker and writer. The advantage of being a professor, the Marquis of Lorne claimed, was having time to think, at least compared to those on the front line of politics. And according to another participant, and I quote again, to have at such a time a great thinker, a man who was a master of style, bind the arguments of history together, and in the quiet of his study develop a powerful chain of reasoning, which showed that the true life of this nation could well be worked out on a scale commensurate with its past, and that it was not unreal to hope for a great unified Britain in the future, was an event of the first importance. At the same time, Seeley was, quote, a great man of letters. His commitment to, quote, political education and, quote, the development of research was also praised. Speakers were clear that Seeley was not a mere cataloguer of facts, that he was not interested in burdening minds with facts. In stressing the importance of a historical library, the Bishop of Peterborough asserted that it would be as vital to students of history as a laboratory was to those learning chemistry. Now, the idea of historical study as a school of statesmanship, a phrase that featured in Seeley's inaugural and is strongly associated with him, is certainly mentioned, while it was asserted too that he was not a doubter in matters of religion. Now, it may be that this was prudence to forestall criticism, but it serves to remind us of the intense controversies around Seeley's, and again I remind you, anonymous religious publications, and of the tangles that had ensnared James Stephen over his essays in ecclesiastical biography first published in 1849, the year he took up the chair. The speeches in 1895 thus reveal some careful negotiations over what it meant to be a historian, their duties and responsibilities. We might call the meeting a moment of articulation, when participants sought to portray Seeley in such a way as to secure his reputation and that of historical studies at Cambridge. In addition to claims about his literary merits and status as a thinker, alongside plans for lasting legacies, such as the library, a portrait, and the medal, several speakers stressed that he was a remarkable teacher, and most were happy to affirm the political relevance of Seeley's work on empire while ensuring that his views on the matter were clearly stated. And this, I take it, is the portrait that was commissioned at that time. Now, there was evidently concern then that Seeley's views on empire were not misunderstood, that they were not seen, as the Master of Trinity put it explicitly, as jingoistic. You can see on the slide how the Marquis of Lorne, who I'll remind you had been Governor General of Canada, summed up Seeley's thesis. Seeley grappled with large issues of international significance, including foreign policy in general, and over many centuries. This was the subject of his last posthumous publication, The Growth of British Policy, and like his work on Stein and Napoleon, it hints at what I would call Seeley's internationalism. Now, it's worth remembering that the study of modern languages was an integral part of the original endowment, since the professor was responsible for employing modern language teachers to benefit students going into public service, thereby yoking together the study of history with contemporary life. Indeed, in an introductory lecture dated 1809 and published in 1840, William Smith referred to the chair as the Professorship of Modern History and Languages. The last book to appear in Seeley's lifetime was actually on Goethe. It was published in 1894 by Seeley and Company and designed to make a great and delightful poet more accessible to English-speaking audiences. Goethe reviewed after 60 years elaborated essays published a decade earlier in the Contemporary Review, and it indicates the breadth and depth of Seeley's literary interests, which also included 2 published essays on Milton. Seeley was not just concerned with Goethe the poet, but discussed the whole range of his output, including the novels, the 2 parts of Faust, his colour theory, Dichtung und Wahrheit, and so on. And at many points in the volume, Seeley addresses the theme of unity. For example, if the unity of his work is remarkable, their unity is more remarkable still. His wisdom had a unity about it. When we look at his teaching as a whole, we find that it has unity, and so on. Now, Seeley was no Goethe, as he knew full well, but it's possible to sense a profound admiration for, quote, the man who took almost as much interest in science as in poetry, who had a love of natural science, and at one point he compares Goethe with Bacon. Both had a prophetic sense of the tendency of science, a profound and just instinct of new scientific developments at hand. Seeley sought then to give a fully rounded sense of Goethe, to offer his readers a sensitive portrayal. Holistic aspirations are articulated at many points in the book, and they remain just as relevant to understanding the practice of history and historians as they were to Seeley's appreciation of Goethe's oeuvre. Now, some commentators have assigned Seeley's publications to different categories, such as religious, historical, literary history, pedagogical, and stress his own distinction between serious writings and more popular writings. I think we may assume that he took context of publication into account when he was writing and adjusted the claims and style accordingly. In his life and mind, however, matters were perhaps more fluid. Now, historians have adopted different emphases in relation to Seeley. Some embrace a story rooted in a model of professionalization and specialization in the development of history as a discipline, while others, and I include myself here, are sceptical about the teleology which such an approach implies. There have been incumbents of the chair in the 20th century who do not fit at all neatly into the professionalisation narrative, which arguably becomes more relevant in the period after World War II. Although even then, David Knowles does not fit neatly into this pattern, and you see him here in 1965, so that's shortly after he'd retired. There is no inherent tension between specialisation and engaging with non-academic audiences. Nonetheless, since the latter is time-consuming, one might accept super-professionals to distance themselves from so-called popularisation. Yet most of the Regius professors have addressed diverse audiences over their career. With J.B. Bury, for example, and I think that's from the 1910s, contributing to the 11th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And that very diversity suggests one way in which it's possible to assess their public profiles. Others include forms of public service undertaken and the range of media in which they have been represented and which they themselves deployed. Now, there are two interrelated strands in what I have said so far that I'd just like to draw out. And one concerns the labile relationships between history and other fields, such as languages, literature, theology, and politics, in Cambridge in particular, as well as more broadly. And the other is about intellectual breadth, clearly present in the case of Seeley and of several other incumbents, including J.B. Bury, and whom I take to be a central figure in any historical account of the chair. While he is often hailed as a quintessentially professional historian, I incline to the view implied by Averil Cameron when she demanded, "Where are they now, the polymaths like Bury?" Now, we may want to consider earlier incumbents too in terms of such breadth, so that rather than dismissing a figure such as Charles Kingsley for not being a proper historian, an issue with which, as Chris mentioned, some of his contemporaries were well aware, it's worth considering the kinds of fluidity that are a notable feature of the period and built in, I would argue, to a notion as protean as history. Kingsley's publications span natural history, public health, the Greeks, advice to women, heroism, architecture, the history of science and medicine, and more. And it was certainly the case that his royal connections played their part in his appointment. As a 1919 article in The Bookman put it, quote, "He was an excellent and unconventional country priest, and by a freak of favouritism only possible in such a country as England, was for 9 years Professor of Modern History at Cambridge." But if his history was picturesque, so were his lectures, and he gave enthusiasm and a love of colour to the service of a chair too often filled by dates and dust. Now, actually, the person in post at that moment was J.B. Bury, and he was very far from this tired stereotype, with his linguistic virtuosity, intrepid travels, witty translations of contemporary verse into Greek and Latin, and his passionate rationalism. And I want to suggest that passionate rationalism is not a contradiction in terms. He was not, in fact, a narrow specialist at all. Now, by 1860, Kingsley was a published historical novelist, someone who engaged with the social, political, and intellectual affairs of his day. He went to Devon to write Westward Ho, where part of it was set, describing himself as, quote, "living in those Elizabethan books." He published lectures on Alexandria and her schools, Paracelsus and Vesalius, and by the way, he lectured on both Paracelsus and Vesalius in Cambridge. He undertook research for Hypatia, his first historical novel, published in 1853, about the female philosopher who died in 415 of the Common Era, and published his lectures as the Roman and the Teuton. Oh, sorry, I meant to show you this. I just found this. I think it's absolutely delightful, but I have no idea what date it is or where it was published. As I say, I simply found it in a box. So, simply the Roman and the Teuton. So Kingsley's public profile is evident not just from his publications, but from the images of him that proliferated during his lifetime and after his death. Among all the members of the lineage, he has been the most portrayed, and there is evidence of this in London's National Portrait Gallery, founded in 1856. In drawing on materials in its rich archive, I'm emphasising the insights to be gained from an institution required to assess the broad historical significance of those whose portraits were to be admitted to the primary collection, which cannot occur without the approval of trustees. And two members of the lineage, of course, G.M. Trevelyan and Owen Chadwick, served in this capacity between 1929 and 54 and 1978 and 94, respectively. As we shall see, distinguished historians are not necessarily deemed to meet the necessary criteria. The gallery's secondary collections, mostly prints and photographs, reveal the wealth of author portraits which have a very long history, including of historians as authors. The gallery's labels and websites assign sitters to categories, allowing us to track changing occupational and social descriptions. Paintings and drawings come with varying amounts of information about provenance, at times scarce, but at others wonderfully revealing. It's also possible to learn about loans and exhibitions, showing how over substantial periods of time a given portrait has been understood, valued, and displayed. There are 47 portraits of Kingsley in the National Portrait Gallery, a drawing, bust, painting, and caricature, together with photographs and prints. So I'd like to invite you to consider this portrait, which is NPG 1284, a drawing of Kingsley presented by the artist in January 1901 and based on a photograph, not an obvious format for a major author. Letters from the artist in question, William S. Hunt, articulate his concern that Kingsley, quote, whose works have given pleasure to thousands of English readers, is not represented in the gallery. And just to remind you that, of course, the gallery wasn't all that old in 1901. The bust of Kingsley by Thomas Woolner is based on the one in Westminster Abbey and thus emphatically celebratory. And that was purchased in 1912, whilst the 1863 painting by Lowes Cato Dickinson arrived by donation in 1932 from, significantly enough, a member of the Macmillan family, whose publishing house served many of the Regius professors. Publishers have in fact been important commissioners of author portraits. Now, as we know, author is a capacious term, and we can see this from, I love this, I have to say, a composite photograph so labelled, simply authors, in which Kingsley appeared a year after his death, which occurred in 1875. And the others that he's associated with in this photograph are J.S. Mill, Charles Lamb, Herbert Spencer, John Ruskin, and Charles Darwin, all of them figures as English celebrities. And this comes from an album that was actually published and therefore could be purchased. Now, most biographies, however brief, like the one in this book, which had little biographies near the photographs, do mention that Kingsley held the Regius chair. And the NPG archive also contains drafts of labels from various times. Kingsley's currently described as novelist and divine on the gallery's really excellent website. But of course, this captures but part of his multifaceted existence. Now, Kingsley's predecessor, fulsomely praised in his inaugural, was Sir James Stephen, a senior colonial administrator, an author of the essays in ecclesiastical biography, to which I referred earlier. And he is represented in the National Portrait Gallery by a bust from 1858 by Marachetti, donated by Sir James's grandson Herbert in 1896, at the time when Herbert's uncle, who was, of course, Leslie Stephen, was a trustee of the gallery. Now, both Leslie, who didn't actually like the bust, and Herbert were assiduous in managing and promoting James's reputation. And actually we see this because James Stephen's Essays in Ecclesiastical Biography were still being republished in the early 20th century, and that was because they kept, I think, pushing for this. Joseph Romilly, whom I mentioned before, and who I think is actually quite adorable, had judged Sir James, and I quote, a very disagreeable man, in 1854, when they were both at Trinity Hall for dinner. And letters from him in the guard book, that is from James Stephen, not Joseph Romilly, in the guard book certainly suggest he was defensive and difficult. He protested his religious orthodoxy in the light of criticism and was especially prickly about money. His broad intellectual interests were evident in the essays, organised around key religious figures and based on book reviews that had first appeared in the Edinburgh Review. Their subjects include Hildebrand and St. Francis, the founders of Jesuitism, Martin Luther, Richard Baxter, and William Wilberforce. They are indeed ecumenical. A blend of biography, history, and theology, Stephen got into hot water by denying the existence of eternal damnation and doubting that it is grounded in authority, by which he meant in the New Testament. Now, in order to make this argument, he invokes the linguistic skills required to do justice to the New Testament, and I do wonder if this is indicative of approaches that he would have encountered in Cambridge when he was a student at the beginning of the century. Now, if we go back a bit further to Stephen's predecessor, who you remember is William Smith, who's also pretty adorable, we encounter a lively, wide-ranging mind. Despite being vulnerable to the accusations of jobbery, as Kingsley was, Smith clearly took his professorial role rather seriously, judging by a printed list of books recommended and referred to in the lectures of modern history. I've seen the one for 1823, but I think it was printed in other years. And that 1823 list runs to more than 20 pages. Now, towards the end of his life, Smith penned evidences of Christianity, drawing, among other sources, on well-known natural theological arguments. And the interest in commemorating him with the bust of Bailey that you saw before, and the fact that his book collection contributed significantly to what came to be known as the Seeley Library, invites us, I think, to give him more consideration. At the same time, we learn from Romilly that he did good impressions, sang at parties, and could talk entertainingly for hours about the Irish playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan, whose son he had tutored. And I have been able to read a very funny, privately printed lecture he gave in 1814 on the theme, "The history of the world is the history of women." So Smith's humour in no way detracts from the evidence of his sustained engagement with British, European, and American history over many centuries. His expectation that students read in a number of languages, grasp the essence of political economy via Smith and Malthus, encounter the Quran, if only by reading a few chapters, and consult libraries outside Cambridge. And I think this all reinforces the point that we should take him a little bit seriously. It's worth emphasizing that Smith, in fact, lectured on contemporary history, as well as on earlier times. Smith was born in 1765, so he was well able to remember the French Revolution, and his lectures on the subject were reissued in 1855, that is after he died, in Bohn's Standard Library, which included major historical works, for example, by Ranke, as well as translations of Goethe and Schiller. Now, my strategy so far has been to sketch in some notable features of a small number of the deceased incumbents, in the hope that some recurrent themes can emerge, approaches to understanding history, the generous intellectual scope of their interests, and the ways in which they might be seen as public figures, for example. The 1895 meeting demonstrated the point particularly neatly because it articulated some of the stakes that were present in efforts to commemorate Seeley, as well as the desire to make them as tangible as possible. Embedded inevitably in commemorative efforts are assumptions about history, as are attempts to bring certain figures to life, to make them and their achievements somehow real. And that, in a nutshell, is why portraits are so useful. They are excellent reputation trackers. The media themselves are revealing, with more prestigious accounts being made in stone, paint and pencil, and prints and photographs, usually cheaper, achieving wider circulation. But more than this, they reveal relationships between artists, sitters and commissioners, the workings and priorities of institutions, and public discourses about national achievements. There are, I want to suggest, qualitative contextual differences between portraits that can assert the national significance of sitters and those arising out of families, friendship networks and colleges, where the effective relationships have been forged within face-to-face communities. Naturally, specific artifacts may and do move between these contexts, but the formal procedures of the National Portrait Gallery allow us a glimpse of the status of particular occupational and social groupings at specific moments. 20th century incumbents of the Regius chair are actually, I'm sorry to tell you, not well represented in the gallery, and with two notable exceptions, are there, if at all, only in photographs. So let's turn to the exceptions. The first exception, you will not be surprised to hear, is George Macaulay Trevelyan, Bury's successor. And of the two, actually, Bury was by far the more professional historian. Now, in addition to 10 photographs, there are 2 drawings of Trevelyan in the collection, one which you're seeing now by Sir William Rothenstein, made in the 1920s, and acquired in 1962 when Trevelyan died. And the other one by Francis Dodd, who sold it to the gallery in 1944 during Trevelyan's trusteeship, having executed it 11 years earlier. Now, Cambridge University actually commissioned a drawing by Dodd of Trevelyan, also 1933. So it may be that he did 2 and he had sort of 1 left over and then he was able to sell it to the gallery. Now, Rothenstein was an extraordinarily interesting figure, a prolific and well-connected portraitist who knew Trevelyan in London. They were on corresponding terms by 1912. There is also a drawing of Trevelyan by Rothenstein at Wallington, the Trevelyan house in Northumberland. And then, in 1937, Rothenstein published a slim volume called Contemporaries, which included a portrait of Trevelyan. Each image there was accompanied by a biographical note written by a friend of the artist. In Trevelyan's case, it was by H.A.L. Fisher, which, while praising his historical gifts, actually hymns Trevelyan as, and I quote, a stalwart Northumbrian landlord, sportsman, and nature worshipper. This format, the combination of portrait, image, and brief biography, found already in 18th century magazines, for instance, reveals the most noteworthy elements of a life at one moment in time, with Fisher, in this case, emphasizing Trevelyan's talents as a biographer. Now, Trevelyan's public profile and success as an author are well known, and his reputation is neatly evidenced by a booklet I found in the National Portrait Gallery archive that was produced by his publishers and circulated around Christmas 1926 in order to push his history of England as a gift. And I'm going to just show you that. So this is 2 openings. There are more openings, but these are 2 openings. I thought it was really, really interesting. So you'll see that it's illustrated by another portrait drawing, and that portrait drawing is well printed on card and actually stuck onto the leaflet. So that's much more time-consuming, obviously, and expensive to produce than one that was just integrated. And please note the biographical details about Trevelyan provided, which start with his pedigree, together with the gloss on the type of history he writes and the invocation of, quote, the average man as the reader, as a potential reader. Now, the medium of drawing, especially when used in portraits that focus on the face, is deemed especially well suited to conveying intimacy. Rothenstein made many such drawings over his life, starting with his student friends at Oxford, while intimacy is a theme that's going to come up in a moment in relation to a more recent post holder. The other exception, perhaps also not so surprising, is Owen Chadwick. And like Trevelyan, he was both an NPG trustee and a recipient of the Order of Merit, and someone who engaged extensively with his predecessors in the chair. And I regret there isn't time to talk about this, but I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about Chadwick is that he was the person who wrote most about earlier incumbents of the chair. And Chadwick is the only incumbent since Acton to have a painted portrait in the gallery, and it's this one. So this portrait is by Derek Hill and was completed in December 1990. And we have the sitter's verdict on it in a note he wrote to a member of the gallery's staff. And he said, "It is wonderfully generous of MPG to do this for me. I like Derek Hill very much. The portrait is not me, and me is in capital letters, but I admire it much as a piece of portraiture. Owen." Now, actually, Hill is quite interesting. I hadn't really thought about him before, but he painted a lot of academics, including other historians such as Asa Briggs and Christopher Hill. And I think it's interesting that his sketchy style is actually rather reminiscent of drawing. Now, one biographical feature that links Trevelyan and Chadwick is, of course, their extensive public service, which in both cases drew on their historical expertise and passions. Academic history, more strictly defined, finds a less prominent place in the National Portrait Gallery, whether we are speaking of sitters or trustees, than might be expected. And I can find no evidence of historians entering the collection, primarily for their achievements as scholarly researchers, even those as distinguished as Regius Professors at Cambridge. Now, I think this portrait reinforces the point. So I expect you recognize that this again is J.B. Bury. So this portrait of him was offered to the gallery in 2004 by his descendants, and it was turned down by curators without being brought to trustees for consideration. In a letter to the Bury family, this decision was explained as follows. Bury would be eligible and was clearly an important scholar in his field, but we also have to make a judgment about the degree to which works we acquire will be displayed, and there is strong competition for space on the walls in this part of the collection. The painting was then offered to a number of other institutions with which Bury was associated, and has finally found a home in the British School at Athens. Now, Bury travelled in and published extensively on Greece. Indeed, his A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great is highly esteemed and enjoyed an extended life in the revised editions, which continue to be recommended to students until recently. Now, I've been unable to find out any information about the artist of this portrait. It looks like Frank Venables, judged by the signature. And I wonder whether he was a competent amateur known to JB and his wife Jane, who was herself an artist. So let's stay for a moment with Bury. I think a real research powerhouse and formidable linguist. In addition to French and German, Latin and Greek, Bury had Sanskrit, Syriac and Hebrew, Hungarian and Russian. His robust approach to religion sets him apart from so many others in the succession. Now, I think it's significant that Bury was Irish. Indeed, his father was a clergyman in the Church of Ireland. And I wonder whether his anti-clericalism and secular rationalism derive from experiences in his first 41 years before he moved to Cambridge. Now, by that point, he had already travelled extensively, but his institutional base had been Trinity College, Dublin, where he was Professor of Modern History from 1893, as well as Regius Professor of Greek from 1898. So for 4 years, he was able to hold both chairs simultaneously. Now, I want to suggest that we can use Bury to reflect on a number of themes, including the ways in which the history of history is undertaken. In addition to his publications on Greece and Rome, Bury wrote about Russia for the Cambridge Modern History, edited and contributed to the Irish literary journal Cottabus, published on Robert Browning, and penned 2 books that are relevant here: A History of Freedom of Thought, 1913, for the Home University Library of Modern Knowledge, and History of the Idea of Progress, published in 1920. Freedom of Thought was designed for a general audience, quote, written with fire and force, according to one review. And if we think about Bury's oeuvre in the light of his numerous contributions to the Rationalist Press Association annuals, a more rounded picture of Bury can perhaps emerge. He may have hated administrative tasks, been consumed by a phenomenal work drive, and impatient with the history tripos as he found it. But here was a man of conviction and commitment, whose writings benefit from being interpreted accordingly. In Histories of History, it is his inaugural lecture that commands most attention, prompting attempts to interpret it as a theoretical statement and to reconcile that statement with his other publications. Bury is quoted quite selectively from that lecture called The Science of History, delivered in the Divinity School on January the 26th, 1903, and critiqued by Trevelyan. The end of his address, which reads, "Though she," by which he means history, "may supply material for literary art or philosophical speculation, she herself is simply a science, no less and no more." And that phrase, that clause of, as you'll see in a second, very long sentence, is repeatedly cited, but generally out of the context of his life and work as a whole, and without considering the rhetorical strategies that Bury was deploying. For example, in the last paragraph, which I'm showing you here, Bury invokes a violent image, stripping the bandages of error from the eyes of men. And I wonder if this is a deliberate provocation, while his invocation of science served his wider purpose as a critic of institutions dominated by religion. Now, of course, we know that science is as protean a notion as history, and historians of science have had much to say about the delineation of the scientific method and of science in the singular over the 19th and 20th centuries, that is about their elevation to quasi-mythical status and availability for strategic use. So I think we should beware of false continuities when we read such terms. Given Bury's interest in the French Enlightenment, Condorcet, for example, and in figures such as Comte and Spencer, so you can see that commitment there, the beginning of the Progress book. So given this, his commitment to tracking, and his commitment to tracking changing understanding and practice with respect to freedom of thought and notions of progress, I think this was bound to involve engagement with science, including the history of science. He clearly possessed a fine grasp of Darwin's evolutionary explanations, for example, which I think was not common among people who simply invoked Darwin. The state of the world, when he wrote The Idea of Progress, was for him only temporary, and it is, quote, the wonderful history of science in the last 100 years that had enabled commentators to gain this insight. Accordingly, he suggests, the value of the idea of progress is itself transient. And I take the preface to this book, with its references to war, written just after the First World War, with its references to war and peace, to socialism in Russia, to a crisis of Western civilization, to actually be a political statement. But this is not to doubt his deep interest in the nature of knowledge, but it is to try and reach for the passions that lay behind his claim about science. Passions that, for the sake of economy, forgive me for putting it so crudely, I'm suggesting may usefully be thought as political. And I think the image that he invokes of enabling the blinded to see suggests precisely this. Now, like so many of his fellow Regius professors, Bury generated a vast body of published work for later generations to work on and puzzle over. And like them, he has been interpreted, quoted, and name-checked as convenient by later historians. Shortly after his death in 1927, two substantial accounts appeared, both born out of friendship. In 1929 by Norman Baines, a Byzantinist in London, and the following year by the modern historian Harold Temperley of Peterhouse. Now, many of the incumbents have been similarly remembered and represented, as I have observed in the cases of William Smith, James Stephen, Charles Kingsley, John Seeley, George Macaulay Trevelyan, and Owen Chadwick. Now, in reflecting on commemorative drives, we might consider ideas of honour, respect, appreciation, and achievement as if the CV unproblematically elicits the response. Scholarly work on heroism should encourage us to go further and think about forms of identification where effective relationships are involved. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting we treat the Cambridge Regius Professors of History as heroes, but I am noting how important forms of friendship are in responses to key figures, and asking whether the notion of a labour of love may sometimes be appropriate. For instance, when applied to the extraordinarily meticulous work Norman Baines did to commemorate Bury, despite the profound differences between them on matters of religion. Baines's memoir drew on materials from Bury's widow, as well as his own memory and expertise, yet he is by no means uncritical of a man he esteemed so highly. Biography and portraiture, taken in their widest senses, inevitably raise these questions about forms of commemoration, types of affinity, mentorship, friendship and affection within occupational contexts. But the theme of love actually occurred to me when I was reading about the Reverend David Knowles. Born Clive Michael Knowles. Quite simply, it struck me how much he was loved by those who knew him and worked with him, perhaps precisely because it was a complex life, marked in some phases by considerable struggle, but one so interwoven with the subjects he studied, a monk examining monasticism, that the person and their researches are inseparable. Knowles's entire life needs to be understood by his vocation as a monk, albeit a somewhat unorthodox one, at times in conflict with his order. There is here a striking intimacy between person and work, between spiritual and intellectual life, indeed between him and his colleagues and friends, that propelled those close to him to record their affection in an unusually open way, invoking Thomas Hardy, whose novels he loved, by saying he was a good man and did good things. Now, according to David Crystal, anniversaries make us reflect. So I hope you will allow me just briefly in the last few minutes to reflect very briefly on my allotted task. Given the many constraints involved, it seemed pointless to name-check all 19 of the deceased incumbents of the chair. Hence, tough selection processes have been involved. Some of them, I must confess, more deliberate than others. For some of the early figures, admittedly apart from Gray, little material is available. But I never planned to spend so much time and energy on Seeley. Admittedly, I knew far too little of him before, except as the alleged founding father of Cambridge history. And I think it was when I discovered the book on Goethe that I really changed my mind and thought there's really something here that's worth pursuing. Seeley's connections with bookselling and publishing, his poetry, and as I've just said, his project to make Goethe better known, invite us to think of him, I think, in a more rounded way. And I'm grateful to Spencer Drake, I don't know if Spencer is here, who shared with me the diary of a young American woman in Cambridge that he transcribed, who attended Seeley's lectures and met him socially. And this gives a very different impression of the man and his family from the claim in the ODNB article that he and his wife were not, quote, at the center of an agreeable social circle. He lacked likeness and touch. They entertained badly. I mean, this is not at all the Seeley that comes across in this diary. Now, I knew of Dom David Knowles before started work on this lecture, but I was entirely unprepared for the emotional qualities suffusing commentaries on him. In acknowledging his complex, austere life, writers such as Christopher Brooke delineate a man of, in his words, exceptional endowment, and went on to say it was hard for those who knew him well not to feel the world much poorer for his passing. And by contrast, I confess, Lord Acton comes across quite differently. He's a figure of undoubted importance, quote, one of the most significant figures in the intellectual and political life of Victorian England, according to J. Rufus Fears. But I confess, when I did reading around this, I found Lord Rosebery, a political associate who appointed him to the chair, and was himself a published historian, a far more engaging figure. Now, in his 1930 pamphlet for the Historical Association, which considered the inaugural lectures of the Oxford and Cambridge Regius chairs since 1841, Leonard Southern Wood gave pride of place to Acton. And I think you can see this here. And I'm quoting the last sentences. I don't know if you can see them easily. I began to write this paper thinking I was listening to an orchestra of 18 strings. Before I had finished, I realized I was listening to a solo with orchestral accompaniment. The soloist is Acton. And it's sort of unclear to me quite what lies behind this. So I think these points illustrate some of the difficulties the study of history throws up. And one is our complex, sometimes semi-conscious reaction to our forebears. Another is the genuine challenge of assessing their significance and doing so in the contexts of their times, which include the publishing industries and the institutional infrastructures within which they operated, as well as the political, economic, social and familial factors in play. While canons are never static, there does seem to be something very like a canon that has emerged, with a certain number of texts and authors, such as Acton, repeatedly cited. And I think Bury's inaugural is a somewhat part of this. The endless quotation of a few phrases from it, where the claim about history as a science is made, usually in isolation from any discussion of what such a claim might actually mean. So to me, Bury has emerged as a fascinating, complex figure, the only historian in the history of the chair who published on ancient, medieval, and modern history, with the enigmatic Knowles as the only medievalist. And despite his early interests, Bury was in fact a staunch supporter of modern history. Now, the history of a specific post is a curious object of historical analysis. One difficulty that faces the historian of the Cambridge chair is the large number of contingent factors that led to one person rather than another being appointed. And even the mechanism of appointment seems to have varied, with the monarch and the prime minister involved to varying degrees. I believe Palmerston is said to have claimed that he wasn't properly consulted at all. So I think there's a whole hinterland here that could be thought about. And there clearly was open consultation, I think, in the past, since we know that no one wanted Oscar Browning, historian bon vivant and Cambridge character, to be appointed when Seeley died. Now, these matters were openly mentioned in newspapers, for example, and there was nothing logical or inexorable about the sequence of appointments. Models of professionalization might encourage the thought that a direction of travel is discernible. Was Trevelyan more of a professional than Seeley? For me, Bury, appointed in 1902, stood out in just this respect. He had the type of commitment to research and publishing in specialist journals from the very start of his career that is more commonly found well into the post-war period. But even he was far more than a professionalized, specialized historian, and his literary concerns never died. And it's worth recalling that Knowles published on the American Civil War and on Macaulay, as well as on monasticism. And I feel I should confess that it's possible that knowing a descendant of Bury's, the late and much missed Michael Bury, a historian of Italian visual and material culture, influenced my reading of J.B.'s work and of the commentaries by Baines and Temperley. But it does not follow that the story of the chair is a mere succession of individuals, however much incumbents acknowledge past predecessors, especially in their inaugural lectures. That past concerns university administration and financial arrangements too. Large themes such as the changing map of knowledge, shift in disciplinary definitions, and in pedagogy, student demographics, reform in the university sector, all play a part. And obviously it's impossible to do justice to such complex themes within a single lecture. One shift, or rather suite of shifts, that I find particularly striking is the kind of communities that the professors were part of. And Romilly's diaries are particularly instructive in this respect, for in them we glimpse the forms of sociability, friendships and intimacies that were possible in a small institution in a small town. And this sense even emerges too from John Neville Keynes, the political economist and registry, in the speech he gave when receiving this portrait by Gerald Kelly to mark his retirement. Now, obviously, it's fortunate that colleges, as we are in college now, are still able to provide something a bit akin to Romilly's and Smith's experiences, even if the machinery of the Central University is in no way comparable to that of even a century ago when Keynes was reaching the end of his career. So there are, needless to say, no simple answers to the question about what has changed since 1724, since it is implausible that there could be some ready-made narratives to be plucked and then served up from the immense volume of source material, especially given the huge number of factors at work. And continuity should not be neglected. I mean, one thing that really struck me is almost everybody I read about is concerned about research, concerned about the relationship between primary and secondary sources, which we often take to be a much more recent concern. Today, it's been possible only to make some tentative suggestions about ways we might think about the history of the post, recognizing that the histories the incumbents practiced, like the context in which they did so, have been magnificently diverse. There's no virtue in tying history down, but there is immense value in constantly reassessing how we tell the history of history by thinking about writings, lives, forms of portrayal, identities, friendships, ideas, deepest commitments, and not forgetting the craftsmanship that historians must deploy. And sometimes these endeavours may well turn out to be labours of love. Thank you.
Fantastic.